Hello, everyone. Welcome back to dinanddaf. This is Elana Stein Hain. Today, we are going to talk about Divrei Soferim, the category that literally means the words of the scribes, and is a category that is often opposed to or put in opposition to Divrei Torah, the words of Torah. But does it actually mean that something's quote unquote only rabbinic? What exactly is this category? The Gemara in Chullin on 28a, for example, Kafchet Amud Aleph, discusses whether the shechita of a bird, the slaughter of a bird, is something that is midivrei Torah. Is it from the words of the Torah, or is it midivrei Soferim? Is it from the words of the scribes? And I want to understand this concept because it really speaks to the role that human beings have played, whether Nevi'im, prophets, whether Chazal, the rabbis, have played in interpreting Torah. How do we understand the status of those interpretations and the role that they've played in transmitting Torah, transmitting laws that had been passed down all the way from before we could remember, all the way from Sinai? What is the role of human beings? How does that impact the status of a given halakha, of a given mitzvah, of a given legal responsibility? So let's go back to Tanakh. Let's go back to the Bible itself. In Ezra, the seventh parak, we have who Ezra alami Bavel. This is the Ezra who came up from Babylon. Again, we're talking about Second Temple times, Shivat Zion, the return to Zion. But who Sofer Mahir b'Torat Moshe? He is a scribe expert in the teaching of Moshe. Asher Natan Hashem Elokei Israel, that God, the Lord of Israel, had given. Vayitein lo hamelech ki yad Hashem Elokav alav kol bakashato. And the king gave him whatever he asked for because God's hand was upon Ezra. A little bit later, this description of this Sofer Mahir, this scribal expert, Ezra, is that it's not just that he's writing things down. It's ki Ezra hechin levavo lidrosh et Torat Hashem. Ezra had prepared his heart, had dedicated himself to study or to seek out the teaching of God, v'la'asot, in order to do it, ulelamed b'Yisrael chok u'mishvat, and to teach in Israel, among the Jewish people, the laws. Meaning, this is not just somebody who's copying one text to another. This is somebody who's teaching, somebody who's expounding, somebody who's explaining. Moreover, in Pasuk Yud Aleph, the next verse, V'zeh parshegen hanishtavan asher natan hamelech Artaxerxes leEzra haKohen haSofer. This is what was written in the letter that King Artaxerxes sent to Ezra, gave to Ezra, who was the scribe, who was the priest. Sofer divrei mitzvot Hashem, who was a sofer of the words of God's commandments, v'chukav al Yisrael, and God's laws on Israel. So what does it mean that he was a sofer, right? So the JPS commentary explains it as he was a scholar. Does it mean he was a teller? Does it mean he was a writer? Does it mean he was even from the word mispar, he was a counter in some way, he enumerated, right? But the point is, he clearly has an important role that isn't simply copying something from one place to another. So when we look in rabbinic literature, we should not be surprised to see that Divrei Soferim is used as something that clearly indicates some human explanatory engagement in Torah that teaches us how to observe Torah. So in the Mishnah in Sanhedrin, for example, chapter 10, Mishnah 3, we're talking about what constitutes a zaken mamre, a rebellious elder, somebody who's rebelling against the teachings of the central religious body of Judaism. So chomer b'divrei Soferim b'divrei Torah. It is more strict regarding words from the scribes than words from the Torah. What do we mean? Ha'omer ein tefillin kidei la'avor al divrei Torah patur. Somebody who says there's no requirement to wear phylacteries in order to transgress what is written in the Torah is exempt. They are not treated like a zaken mamre. Parenthetically, that could be because it's a zil kari bei rav. Anybody can go see in the Torah that there is a requirement. It's right there, explicit in the Torah. So the zaken mamre is not really going to be undermining anything. But if they say chamisha totafot, Lohusif al divrei sofrim chayav. But if they say there should be 5 compartments in one's tefillin in order to add to the words of the scribes, that is a problem, right? Then they are tried, they are liable as a zaken mamre, as a rebellious elder. So what's the difference between Divrei Torah and Divrei Sofrim here? Sounds like at the very least, Divrei Torah is something that is clear in the Torah itself. You open it up, you say, Vayu l'totafot beinenecha. They should be as totafot between your eyes. Got it. But it doesn't say in the Torah how many compartments, right? How do we figure that out? That's going to be an explanation that is offered by human interpreters, right? So maybe the difference is explicit versus interpretive. I also want to note from the word numbers, right? Sofer, like mispar, numbers, it's also about numbers, right? Meaning 4 compartments in the tefillin, right? And the Yerushalmi and Shkalim actually says this is what the Soferim were. The Soferim were people who counted. Amar Rabbi Abahu says, K'tiv, it's written in Divrei Hayamim Aleph, Chronicles, the first Chronicles, Mishpachot Sofrim Yoshvei Yabetz. There were families of Sofrim who lived in Yabetz. Matamud Lomar Sofrim, why are they called Sofrim? What does this mean? Elashasu et Torah Sfurot. They taught Torah by the numbers. For example, Chamisha lo yitromu. They said 5 categories of people are not supposed to give truma, are not supposed to give the offering that goes to the Kohen. For example, if somebody is naked, they're not supposed to do that. If somebody is drunk, they're not supposed to do that. But the point is there are 5 categories. And then it goes on with other categories, right? There are 36 instances of somebody getting karet in the Torah where they get punished with excision, whether that means loss of world to come or it means early death, God forbid, lo aleinu, all those things. There are 36 of those kinds of infractions in the Torah by the numbers. So Sofrim is, they're teaching you Torah, but they're also teaching you Torah by the numbers, right? Now, it's very interesting. It's very interesting because it does have this combo of, it's by the numbers, but they're also clearly grouping things and analyzing and explaining and interpreting, right? I mean, there's more than just numbers going on here. There's some sort of explanatory piece. So we kind of see that. Now in the Bavli and Kiddushin, it's a little more just about the numbers, right? Lefichach nikru rishonim sofrim. The early ones were called sofrim, counters. Shayu sofrim kol ha'odiot shebatorah, because they would count all the letters in the Torah, right? So shayu omrim vav de gachon, the vav in the word gachon in Parshat Shmini in Vayikra is chetzian shel otiot shel Sefer Torah. It's halfway through the letters of the Torah, which you'll see sometimes in a Chumash. It'll point that out, right? Darosh, Darash, also in around there in Vayikra. Darosh, Darash is chetzian shel hatevot. It's shel tevot. It's halfway through the words in the Torah. This sounds a little bit more just like scribes, right? Meaning we're so careful. We know how many letters and we know how many words and we know how many verses. Right? Meaning, and then it goes on to talk about Tehillim also. So that sounds a little more scribal. The Gemara in Shkalim, the Yerushalmi in Shkalim gave us, I think, a little bit more of also the explanatory, the analysis, a little bit more interpretive lens as well. There's one more piece to this besides for numbers and interpretation, and that is essentially takanot, meaning making decrees, right? Those are also called Divrei Soferim, right? Just to keep it interesting. So, Amar Rabbi Chia bar Abba, Amar Rabbi Yochanan in the Gemara in Megillah. Rabbi Chia bar Abba says in the name of Rabbi Yochanan, "My dichtiv," what is meant when Moshe tells about getting the luchot, about getting the 2 tablets at Har Sinai? It says, "Va'aleim kechol advarim asher diber Hashem imachem bahar," and on them are all of the words that God spoke to you at the mountain. That all, right? That all is doing a lot, right? The rabbis see the word all and they're like, whoa, what does this come to include? Melamed, it teaches, Sheher Awa Kadosh Baruch Hu Moshe, that God shows Moshe dikdukei Torah, The specifics, the derivations, the particulars of Torah, question mark, v'dikduke sofrim, and the particulars, the interpretation, the derivations, question mark, of the sofrim, u'masha sofrim atidin lechadesh, and also what the scribes are going to innovate. Umay nihu, and what are the scribes going to innovate? Mikra Megillah, reading the Megillah, right? Meaning there are certain mitzvot, right? Whether it's lighting Hanukkah candles, reading the Megillah, there are certain mitzvot where we say these were later enactments. These were not enactments that are in the Chumash. They're not in the 5 books. They're later enactments, right? So it seems like Divrei Soferim, we've got certain things where it's just good scribes understanding the Torah, being able to say, not understanding the Torah, counting the Torah, right? Being able to say, this is the halfway point. We've got Divrei Soferim, or at least we've got Soferim, that they're kind of analyzing the Torah for us. They're consolidating, they're interpreting 5 of this and 10 of that and 15 of that and 36 of that, but it comes from also interpretations and derivations. And we have Soferim that are innovating new takanot, new decrees. So very, very, very interesting stuff. And then I think we're stuck with the question of, okay, what exactly is Divrei Soferim? This is a very big category. What does it include and what is its status? Does it include things that are biblical because it's interpretations, like 4 compartments in tefillin? Is that biblical? Yeah, it's an interpretation, but it's based on interpretation of the Torah, right? Well, Hanukkah, I know that's not biblical. It's not even in biblical times. So the takanot are rabbinic, but the interpretations are biblical. What are we talking about with Divrei Sofer? So the place where people like to work this question out is in the words of the Rambam, because the Rambam says some very interesting things, right? He definitely organizes it for us, but there are some question marks that people are left with. So let's start with the Rambam's explanation of a Mishnah in Kalim. The Mishnah in Kalim is talking about measurements, right? Which is also interesting. It's talking about numbers, right? It's talking about measurements, how much, how little, what disqualifies, okay? And he says, Kol ma shalohit be'er b'lashon haTorah. Anything that is not stated explicitly, plainly in the language of the Torah, Yikaremi Divrei Soferim. It is called from the words of the scribe. Anything that is not written explicitly in the Torah is Divrei Soferim. Okay, now question mark. Does that mean it's rabbinic? Question mark. Right, we'll get there. V'afal pi shehadvarim hein halakha leMoshe miSinai. Right. He says, even if those things that were not written explicitly in the Torah are things that we say were transmitted to Moshe at Sinai and were transmitted since then to us, right? Which, parenthetically, that sounds pretty biblical, doesn't it? Right? That too is called Divrei Soferim. Lefi shema'amar midivrei Soferim, because the term from Divrei Soferim, from the words of the scribes, Yichlol, it includes Sheyeh hadavar da'at Soferim. It's something that the Soferim believe. Kimo, haperushim, the explanations of Torah, right? 4 compartments in tefillin. Ve'halachot hamekubalot min Moshe miSinai, and even the laws that were transmitted to them from Moshe at Sinai, meaning it means it's da'at Soferim, meaning the Soferim agree with this. The scribes agree with this, okay? But it also includes otikun Soferim. It also includes the decrees of the Soferim, kimo atakanot v'agzerot, like takanot and gzerot, okay? Like decrees, like lighting Hanukkah candles. Now, I want to just say, when I see that, I say to myself, oh, okay. So maybe Divrei Soferim can sometimes mean biblical, as in when the rabbis explain something derive it from the pasuk, but it's not explicit in the pasuk. Or when the rabbis say it's a transmission from Sinai, there you go, that's biblical Divrei Soferim. And there can also be rabbinic Divrei Soferim, like when there's clearly an innovation done by the prophets or by rabbis. You could do takanot, right? And that could be rabbinic, right? I'm trying to set it clear in my head here, right? Great. Sounds like that could work. But we're not done with the Rambam, okay? We have the Rambam in Sefer HaMitzvot. Now, the Rambam in Sefer HaMitzvot is continuing a Gaonic tradition of counting all 613 mitzvot and saying, I'm going to tell you how we enumerate these mitzvot. Now, there are a gazillion more things in Judaism than 613, a gazillion more. However, that is why the Rambam has to state, these are the things I'm going to count, and these are the kinds of things I'm not going to count. So in his introduction to the Sefer HaMitzvot, to the book of mitzvot, which is basically a book of the enumeration of mitzvot, he inserts shorashim, basically principles beforehand, to explain this is what I'm leaving out of my count, and this is what I'm including in my count. So in the second shorash, the second principle, he says as follows. Hashorish hasheni, the second principle, I'm calling it, literally root. She'ein ra'ui limnot, kol ma shelimidim or lomdim, ba'achat mishlosh esrei midot she'atorah nidreshet behen, o beribui. He says, we should not count in the 613 anything that is learned from one of the 13 principles of interpretation, right? Rabbi Ishmael had Bishlosha Esrei Midot, Bishlosha Esrei Midot HaTorah Nidreshet Behen, right? The Torah is explained through 13 different hermeneutical rules, 13 different reading rules, including Kal V'chomer is in there, right? It's like, if this is true, then of course that is true, right? Or Binyan Av, an archetype from here being applied over there, right? There are 13 of those. He says anything that's interpreted through those and derived from the Torah through those. Or, by the way, through just an expounding, like this extra vav or this word et adds this other thing. He says, I'm not counting those as the 613. Okay, let's find out more. Hine, which by the way sounds like not biblical, right? So there goes my theory of, well, anything that's derived from the Torah or is transmitted from Moshe at Sinai, that's biblical Divrei Soferim, but anything that is a takana, is a decree, that's rabbinic Divrei Soferim. But let's see where he goes. Hine lo kol ma shenimtza hachachamim sheotziu behekesh mishlosh esrei midot nomar shehu ne'emar leMoshe miSinai. He says, look, you all know that I don't think that all things that the rabbis derive using the 13 principles of exegesis or hermeneutics or explaining were said to Moshe at Sinai. V'lo gam kein nomar b'chol ma shenimtzeim b'Talmud yismechu el achat mishlosh esrei midot shehu d'Rabbanan. He says, but I'm also not going to say that every time the rabbis derive something from the 13 principles, it's always, quote unquote, only rabbinic. Ki pa'amim yiyeh perush mikubal, because sometimes actually it's just a transmitted, accepted explanation, and they're not really deriving it from the 13 principles. It was already passed down. So now it sounds like if they're deriving it from the 13 principles and it wasn't, well, let's see. Lefichach says, therefore, hara'ui bezeh, here's the right way to do it. Shekol ma shelo timtze'ehu katuv b'Torah, anything that you do not find expressly stated in the Torah, v'timtze'ehu b'Talmud, but you find it in the Talmud, shelamduhu, or limduhu, probably lamdu, I don't know. Be'achat, right, is it that they were learning or they were teaching? Be'achat mishlosh esrei midot, that they derive it using one of the 13 principles. Im be'aru heim be'atzmam, if they themselves explain, and say this is the essential explanation of the Torah, or this is biblical, if they say that, then I'll count it. Wow. Sheha mekablim or mekubalim amru shehu d'oraita, because those who accepted it said that it's biblical. V'im lo yivaruzeh, but if they don't say this expressly, they interpret something, they derive something from the 13 midot, the 13 ways of deriving things from the Torah. If they don't say that what they're deriving is biblical, or I should say, or indicated in some other way, because I'm going to add that, because sometimes it will come through deductive reasoning more. Velo dibrubo, right? And they didn't say anything about it. Hinehu d'Rabbanan. We assume it's rabbinic. Ooh-wee. She'ein sham katuv yorelav, because you don't have a pasuk that teaches it explicitly. Wow. So now it sounds like what he's saying is actually 3 categories. We know that there are takanot that are rabbinic. We know there are decrees that are rabbinic. Got it, like Megillah, like Hanukkah. We know that there's Halakha Moshe Sinai, things that were transmitted to Moses at Sinai, transmitted all the way down to us. That's Divrei Soferim, but it's biblical. And then we have the matter of things that were derived through the 13 principles. Some of them are biblical. If the rabbis say they are, the others are rabbinic. That's what he seems to say. Ki kol ma shelo shamu b'Sinai b'veur, because anything that they didn't hear at Sinai explicitly, hinegu mi Divrei Soferim. It's from the words of the scribes. Hine kvar hitba'er ki taryag mitzvot shenemru lo Moshe Sinai. Says it's clear the 613 mitzvot that were given to Moshe at Sinai, lo yimaneh bahem kol ma she'ilamed b'shlosh esrei midot va'afilu bizmano alav shalom. It should not include those that were derived from the 13 principles, even if Moshe himself derived them. Kol sheken shelo yimaneh bahen ma shehotziu oto ba'acharit zman. And how much more so the later derivations not get included. Ooh. We are in dangerous territory. Because right now it sounds like the Rambam just said, you're telling me that things that were derived, laws that were derived from the 13 midot, rabbinic interpretations based on the 13 midot, you're telling me those are not biblical unless the rabbis say they are biblical? They're only dirabbanan, quote unquote. Whoa, that's going to include a lot of stuff. What? The Ramban doesn't like it at all. The Ramban says, what is going on here? He says, Uplia dat mimeni niskava lo uchala. I don't understand what he's saying. She'im nomar, if we say, ki ein hamidot nidrashot mekubalot misinai, what he's essentially saying is we didn't get the 13 principles at Sinai. And we were not commanded to expound Torah and explain Torah based on them. Then then they're not true. And the only truth is the explicit, plain interpretation of the text. Not the thing that was expounded upon and interpreted. Like the rabbinic saying, verse never leaves its original, its plain meaning. And ve'akarnu, then what we've done here is we've uprooted shorish kabbalatenu biyud gimel midosh atran nidreshet. We've uprooted the 13, this notion that we accepted that that it was a transmission of the 13 principles that the Torah is going to be explained, by which the Torah is going to be explained. Ve'rov haTalmud asher yisad behem, and most of the Talmud. The Ramban rejects. He says, how could the Rambam say this? How could the Rambam say this? That things that were derived in the 13 principles without saying that they're to oraita biblical, we assume they're to Rabbanan. How could he say this? Right? The Ramban is dead set against. Dead set against. Now, I want to end with a 16th century figure, the Megillat Esther. His name is Rav Yitzchak Leon Ibn Sur, who generally tries to protect the Rambam, generally tries to defend the Rambam against the Ramban's attacks. And he tries to defend him here too. And he says, you know what? I think ki kama ma'alot tovot la Rabbi Shimon Baal Zohar Rakia Aleinu. He says, I'm so lucky that I know this wonderful scholar, that I've heard of this wonderful scholar, that I've read this wonderful scholar, Rav Shimon, who is the one who wrote the Zohar HaRakia. Why? Shepiresh lanu bezeh hashoresh kavanat harav, because he was able to explain the Rambam's intention be'ofen ki ein alav tshuva klal mikol ra'ayot Ramban, in a way that the Ramban's challenges mean nothing. Meaning, he explains it in a way that basically says the Ramban misunderstands the Rambam. Shinehu katav v'hochiach bezeh hashoresh, because he wrote and proved regarding this principle, shegam zohi kavanat harav, the rabbi, meaning the Rambam, also thought shekol davar hanilmad b'yud gimel midot, that anything that was written, that was derived from the 13 principles, hu min haTorah, it's biblical. V'dino kedina dvar hamufurashim b'Torah, and they are just like the things that were explicitly stated in the Torah. Rak shalo yavo b'minyan taryag mitzvot. The reason he says they're durabanan here, he's just saying, I'm not counting them in the 613. So why does he use the word durabanan though? Why does the Rambam use the word durabanan, rabbinic? V'lo kra'am durabanan al hayoto sover ki yesh lahakel b'hem ki divrei takanotehem u'gzerotehem. He says, he didn't say that the 13 principles, things derived in the 13 principles, where they don't say explicitly that it's biblical, that he means that it's really rabbinic and you can treat it this with the same kind of leniency that you could treat rabbinic decrees. Rather, aval kra'am durabanan, he calls them rabbinic, mipnei shehem pirshuhu lanu, because the rabbis explained them to us. Lo ba beferush b'Torah, and it's not explicitly written in the Torah. Meaning, don't get confused. The Rambam also thinks everything learned from the Yud Gimel Midot is biblical. He calls it rabbinic because he just means the rabbis had to explain it to us. Okay? Now, this is amazing. I gave you, for further reading, for further listening, I gave a share on this a while back. Where does rabbinic parshanut, where does rabbinic exegesis, rabbinic interpretation of the Torah, where does it come from? But for now, what I want people to walk away with is two things. Number one, a recognition that the term Divrei Soferim, it's not clear whether it means rabbinic or biblical. There are some things that are Divrei Soferim that are clearly rabbinic, lighting Hanukkah candles, reading Megillah. There are some things that are Divrei Soferim, things that were learned from Sinai, which is basically like the measurement of a mikvah, measurements, we say, right? Clearly biblical, but we call them Divrei Soferim. And then there are things where it seems like there's a debate going on here, right? There's a debate going on here. Things that are derived from the 13 principles. How much do we say they're biblical? How much do we say they're rabbinic, right? And I gave you an article for anybody who wants to read, arguing that the Megillat Esther is right about the Rambam based on what the Rambam does in the Mishnah Torah, but his halakhic work. So I want people to walk away saying, oh, Divrei Soferim includes a lot. It doesn't just include rabbinic things. It includes biblical things also. And then there's the sort of mysterious in the middle. Second thing I want people to walk away with is just to think about the different roles that rabbis, prophets, chazal, the different roles that have been played by human beings in transmitting Torah. Sometimes the role is to transmit. Sometimes the role is to use interpretive tools. Sometimes the role is to make decrees. And those are three very, very, very different roles. And it just behooves us to think about it. And I would also say to appreciate that Chazal's outlook included all of these roles. It's really remarkable, actually. As always, thank you for learning with me.